I think they're really two sides of the same coin. So if a government is achieving, or aiming at least, the common good and justice, it is a good form, whether it be a monarchy, an aristocracy, or democracy. If it is instead seeking the particular interests of those who rule, the rulers, versus the ruled, even, ironically, and this is where people get confused with this right-hand side of this grid, the corrupted form of democracy is if all the people rule, but they rule in their self-interest only.
Right. That
is the corrupted form.
It's still democracy, but it's democracy not for the benefit of everyone.
Now Cicero, in the Roman era, he comes back, and there were a few others, Polybius and others, but they're writing again on this, and they actually try to resolve this confusion. And what they call the corrupted form, at that bottom right corner, is ochlocracy, or mob rule.
Ochlocracy, okay.
Right? Yeah. So, and this brings me back to where I said, you know, you often hear republic versus democracy. Notice the word republic isn't in there at all in that grid.
I noticed that.
Again, because it's a Latin term. So Aristotle wouldn't have used it. But the Republic of Cicero, in a sense, was looking back to Aristotle's theory and Aristotle's belief that he had a solution to how do you have a long-standing government, you know, a stable government that will continually be a good government and not devolve to its corrupt form. Aristotle's solution was, let's take each of those forms, each of those political classes, the demos, the people, the aristos, the best, and a monarch, and we'll put those three forms together, and they'll balance each other out. And that's the key, the concept of balance. And these particular interests won't have the power to rule for their particular interests and contrary to justice and the public good. Now that brings us 2,000 years later to the founding of this country. And that Aristotelian, and of course, as I said, Cicero following along with that, that theory of constitutions, that 2-by-3 structure was still in place. And if we go to Madison, who I would say is the architect of the Constitution, and I brought two books here, and I'll explain them in a second.
And that's James Madison.
James Madison. This is the concept of constitutions that he's working with as he's trying to come up with, during the pre-constitutional convention period, what ought we do in America to take this newly formed democratic, popular form of government, you know, the people rule rather than the king, or rather than Parliament, and instead Parliament or king or whatever form of government is the functionary of the people.
How long did it take for this whole process to take? You know, did they sit down for weeks, months, years? How long was this process in evolving from the germ of the idea all the way to the government being established?
Well, I'd say there's three things to that. I hadn't thought about that, but that's an interesting question. The first is that most of the founding generation, those who were influencing the technical decisions of what was going to be the form of government and the processes, they were all classically educated. They read Aristotle, they read Cicero, they read all the other works about political history and political philosophy, so they knew that
in a sense they were elitists. They were very knowledgeable
in that original sense of elite.
Knowledgeable and thoughtful, and looking to the past to divine what to do in the future.
But I would argue they are not what in the early 20th century, particularly a guy named Charles Beard, very, very important historian, American historian. He wrote a book called The Economic Interpretation of the Constitution, and he roots his book on an interpretation of what I'm going to focus on in a minute, which is the 10th Federalist paper written by Madison. And he argues that the Federalists' papers and the Constitution is an elite document. It's an aristocratic document rather than a democratic document. And this is actually where we get some of this. When people say republic versus democracy, they're saying they rejected democracy and they wanted a republic which is representative elites rule and the people are the ruled. We have subjects and we have rulers. And I don't think you can find that in Madison at all. Certainly there were people at the time that believed in that, but I don't believe that that's where our country's foundation is. And I think if you read, and I really encourage people to read this, well, I'll explain these books in a second, but Madison is again starting at the question of what is the ideal form of government in practice. There's three dimensions in a sense. There's who rules, there's for what end, as I just explained, and then the real thing that's never been solved in history at the time that Madison is writing is how.
That third dimension.
How do we do it, right? What form of government do we put? What institutions, what policies and practices to shape the discourse? Those sort of things has never been solved. And that's what they set out to solve in the Constitution of the United States.
Let me ask you a question real quick before we go on with the Constitution. I remember reading that George Washington, there were individuals within the framers of the Constitution that wanted Washington to be king. True or not?
Oh yeah, there certainly were. I mean, you got to realize that that's the way the world was, and you had kings, and America really was an experiment. And if you read the Federalist Papers, you'll see that I believe it's in the first Federalist paper written by Hamilton. He says, this is a test to see whether we can prove whether reason can create a good, solid form of government that will be long-lasting, or if we're just fated to whatever happens, happens. And it's a test not just for us in America, but a test for the world. And they understood the significance of what their experiment in democracy was going to be. So Aristotle gets to the point, ethics is the key. Madison is looking at it from this perspective. How do we obtain the common good and justice through practice? And he starts off by saying a well-constructed union is going to solve the mortal disease that has destroyed all forms of government and all forms of popular government in the past, and that is factionalism, which is the equivalent of partisanship, seeking your self-interest.
Okay. We're going to begin this idea of, we're going to move forward with some other ideas that you talked about on another show following this. But just to wrap it up, we talked earlier before the show about parties. Are parties a necessity?
Well, that's the key. What I'll show you when we continue this is that parties were the evil, the disease that needed to be fixed, but you can't get rid of them. So what you do is you don't try to eliminate them, but you try to eliminate their effect on government. We didn't want one party or another party or parties ruling. We wanted people ruling for the interest of the whole rather than part, which is what party means, ruling in the interest of part.
So not marginalize parties per se, but minimize the overpowering nature of having one or two or three or four or whatever number of parties.
They were not supposed to be an essential core or legitimate part of our government.
Great. We're going to leave it at that. We'll come back with another show, which will be on a different time for a broadcast. But I'm David Stevenson. This has been Progressive Soup. Charlie Grapski is our constitutional scholar. Good evening for now, and we'll be back in a few minutes or another day, depending upon your dimensional perspective.